The problem is for other attorneys, family law attorneys, business attorneys, where they're constantly making withdrawals from their trust accounts into their operating accounts of monies earned. So you have to have a secure, reliable online trust account. And I say online because that is where we're going. That is
Mhm.
the future. We are always going to technology and we're going to advance the processes to make things more efficient.
Welcome to the Law Practice Today podcast, where you will hear updates on hot topics, tips, and ideas that can help you run a more successful law practice. Now, this show is brought to you by the Law Practice Division of the American Bar Association. So that means the views and the opinions shared on this podcast do not represent the ABA or the Law Practice Division, but they are the views of each individual participant. And any products or services discussed do not represent any kind of endorsement from the ABA or the Law Practice Division. Now let's get back to the show. Welcome back to another episode of the Law Practice Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about a topic that so many law firms, especially the solo and the small firms, have to keep in mind. And that is when you are using online services to collect payments from your clients. When trust accounting is involved, there are some precautions, some things you need to be aware of. And so we have a great attorney who is living through the reality of that, even in his own firm. And he wrote an article for the Law Practice Today podcast. Michael, welcome to the show.
Terrell, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So, Michael, for people who may not have read the article already, can you give us a little background on yourself and your firm?
My name is Michael D. Eisenberg. I have been a solo practitioner for nearly 20 years. I mostly represent veterans before the VA. I do some military records corrections, and I also deal with some med board, PEP boards, and military examination boards, physical examination boards about whether or not the military member is currently fit for duty and whether or not they should get a military separation or a military retirement. So my use of trust accounts actually is very limited in the sense of, for the records corrections and the med boards, the money's deposited in there until earned. With the VA, there's a question about whether or not you can have your money, which is a contingency fee, either deposited straight into your operating account or into your trust. But because of communication issues and delays with the VA, I always have it put in the trust account just to make sure that in case the veteran has some sort of objection to my fee, this way I can't be accused of taking something that wasn't mine. And then once everything's clear, I pay myself. The problem is for other attorneys, family law attorneys, business attorneys, where they're constantly making withdrawals from their trust accounts into their operating accounts of monies earned. So you have to have a secure, reliable online trust account. And I say online because that is where we're going. That is the future. We are always going to technology and we're going to advance the processes to make things more efficient. The problem with that is the ethics rules become more complicated. The ABA, rules 1.5, maintaining client property separate from your own, rule 1.1 comment 8 being up to date and reasonably competent on the tech you're using. That doesn't mean you have to master the tech, but you have to understand either how you're going to use it or to make sure that you hire someone who is going to use it properly. And that's a problem for the small and solo practitioners, is that there are a lot of bookkeepers out there who are willing to take on you, the small practitioner, as a client. So finding that is usually the biggest hurdle that lawyers have to face. Because look, I'm not a financial expert. I'm not an accounting expert. I know that I need help with stuff like that. And that is why I have my own bookkeeper. But there are lawyers who are going to be doing it on their own, who are going to be experimenting on their own. And they're going to be going, well, everyone's online. I might as well use one of these online services. And I listed several that are possibilities for lawyers to use. And I invite you to go back to that article. But that doesn't mean your due diligence stops there.
That's true.
You
That makes
still
sense.
have to not only look at the pamphlets, but you also have to talk with the provider and also look at the materials they have available. You got to make sure that their system is encrypted, that you're using two-factor authentication, that you have to know where the accounts are. When I say where the accounts, where your online accounts are, where are their servers?
Can I
Yeah,
ask a couple of questions about that? You
sure.
mentioned about, that the information is encrypted. Like, for let's say we're talking to a solo or small law firm
Mhm.
owner who doesn't have much of a tech background, like how would they know if it is encrypted or not? Or like how do they find that
You
out?
ask and you do research, or you contact someone who may know, or who can find out for you, or who knows to ask the right questions. Does that make sense?
It does. So let's say, for example, like if you were approaching, let's say, there's a new online service or payment processor reached out to you and said, "Hey, Michael, we can save you 3% on every transaction." Like, what is the question you would ask them to say, "Okay, I need to know if their information is encrypted." Is it as simple as like, "Hey, are your transactions or is your software encrypted?" Is that the question you would ask?
That's one of the questions. So you have
Okay.
to make sure that their servers are secure, that they are within the country, at least that you operate in, that they're not like backed up in China or backed up in a third world country where your information could be, seen or regulated or obtained by the government or some other, third party who is not, privileged to this information. One excellent idea actually comes from the state of New York. They require that any attorney using an online trust account system, that the company requires a subpoena in order for anyone else to get access to that information.
That makes sense.
But also things like two-factor authentication, strong passwords. When I say strong passwords, of course, we know the ones not to use, your birth date, 1234, password, etc. It needs to make sure that it's a complex password pretty much generated by one of those password minders. My favorite happens to be 1Password. There are several out there, but for instance, like one not to use is LastPass. They've had a variety of security issues, but find one that your colleagues are using, find one that you're comfortable with, and find one that generates complex passwords that will sync across devices. That's important because if you're not at your desk, but in a different state or different place, and you need to access your trust account, you need to be able to do that mobily or on someone else's computer with the appropriate password, of course, and have two-factor authentication. Just in case someone gets a hold of your password, you want to make sure that they need something else like your mobile device.
Gotcha.
And of course, your mobile device needs to be not only password protected, but ideally biometrically protected with either your face or your thumb.
Gotcha. I mean, there's so many different things to think
Mhm.
about and consider there. And so, another question that came up as you were sharing some of the context and background, you mentioned about how challenging it is for solo and small firms to find competent bookkeepers or
Mhm.
bookkeepers who actually understand the legal industry. So, how did you go about finding your bookkeeper, who actually understood trust accounting?
Trial and error. I went through several bookkeepers and I finally found one who, she's a solo bookkeeper, if you will, and she's been dealing with law firms for 20 plus years. And we clicked and she's been great. Meanwhile, over time, I've been using it's now 8 a.m. Law Pay
Okay.
because they do a really good job of making sure that your transactions versus your fees, because you still have to pay a fee to the company and you don't want that company drawing from your trust account to pay its monthly bill or its finance charges. And they were one of the first that I came across. That was their main selling point, that we will keep our transactions for business separate from your trust account transactions. And that has got to be a major consideration when you work with any of these companies.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, because, even as you were talking early on about, for a lot of solo law firms, I often hear them say, like, hey, you know what? I don't have that many trust account or trust transactions. The interesting thing that I think about is it seems like even if a company doesn't have that many trust transactions, if one of them gets out of whack, it could have a pretty, I guess, some implications from the bar association
Yeah, oh yeah.
if an audit is done. Like, even if you don't do that many, you still want to get it right.
Which should serve as a reminder to the listeners that you should probably check your trust account daily. I mean, to be honest, one of the first things I do in the morning is I take my phone, I double check my operating account, and I double check my trust account, make sure there's nothing kind of wonky going on.
Mhm.
There's a case out of Florida, I think, where the attorney in question had a $35,000 withdrawal from her trust account. it was illicit. And her problem was she didn't act on it quickly enough because she only checked it once a week versus every day.
Wow.
And I believe she got some problems with the bar.
Wow. I mean, it makes sense to have, those banks that do allow you to have like daily alerts of
Mhm.
just like, hey, if a transaction over a certain amount is coming, if money's coming out that you did not expect, like, yeah, action needs to be taken. It reminded me of an interesting time, like back when was Silicon Valley Bank that went under where there were some clients that I had in California who were
Mhm.
using them for like their operating account and their
Right.
trust account to where I think that there's so many different, I guess, areas where trust accounts can run into an issue, even if the lawyer did everything right. But if there's something you're not on top of, you're not paying attention to, it could really create some serious issues for you.
Now, I forget in that situation, and this kind of goes back to your due diligence. I don't mean you personally, I mean the listener, that whatever bank they're using needs to be FDIC
Yeah.
secure. And if it's not, was that bank FDIC?
I believe it was. The
Okay.
challenge that and this didn't happen to any of my clients personally, but I had heard about some other firms where they had funds that exceeded the normal FDIC limit in that bank to where
Ah,
then it brings up this big question about like, well, if you're over the limit and the bank defaults, then it's like, hey, all of those trust funds, like who's responsible for replenishing those?
mhm.
And I believe there were some articles and some, I guess, the ABA started try to weigh in and try to get the government in to say, hey, these type of accounts, these trust accounts need to be insured for their 100% balance because the money doesn't belong to the law firm. So if the law firm is getting in trouble because the bank went under, like this creates huge problems for that law firm. I think it was probably a very big headache for the law firms who were deeply impacted by that.
I would not want to be in that situation. And thankfully, or case may be, my fees usually don't go that high. I wish they did, but unfortunately, they don't.
Gotcha. So, I mean, I'm very curious for you. I mean, as you mentioned, you don't have a ton of trust accounting activity. When it came down to writing this article, how did you go about like really doing the research? Were there some other people that you talked to or sources that you referenced to research some of these topics?
I looked at a variety of articles. I mean, because I could ask other attorneys, how do they do their trust accounting? But I don't think they really want to share that and, be quoted inadvertently or have the time to talk about, well, this is how I do it. Because that's probably like the last thing that anybody wants to talk about is how they do trust accounting. Of all the things that they want to talk about, lawyers don't want to talk about trust accounts because it's a pain in the butt. However, I was just reviewing a variety of articles that I found on the web, several bar association publications, and also I found a listing or two of respected bar association suggestions on different trust account programs, online trust accounts. And then I researched into them more in depth and found which the ones I thought were most appropriate. Ideally, though, a caveat on that. Number one, don't trust what I say. Don't trust what the article says for two reasons. One, you still have to do your due diligence. You still have to look at it yourself and make sure nothing's changed. But along the lines of due diligence is the fact that your state bar may have nuances or differences, my state bar or my district bar, in my case, and also different than the ABA. And if you also practice in multiple states, you have to be compliant with each of those states. And each state may be a little bit different.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. I want to be respectful of your time. So, if people are interested in like checking out the article or they're interested in even checking out some of the other stuff that you're doing, whether it's content you're doing for your own firm or other podcasts, things that Michael are up to, where should they find you? Where can they look for you online?
Well, I'm going to give you a small list because there's some things I want to encourage the listeners to do. Number one, if you're not a member of the APA, consider joining. I say that because I think my article may be behind a paywall. It's what precautions should lawyers using online services to manage trust accounts be aware of. That was written, just for reference for everyone, that was written on May 15th, 2025. It's still good today. I also want to encourage your listeners to check out the ABA Tech Show coming up in March next year in Chicago, Illinois. There will be a ton of vendors there, including some banking vendors that deal with trust accounts. I believe 8am LawPay, amongst others, will be there. Third, I invite your listeners to check out my blog at thetechsavvylawyer.page. And of course, its accompanying podcast, the techsavvylawyer.page podcast. Your podcast can be found not only on the blog, but anywhere you get your podcast feeds, whether it's Apple, Spotify, etc. And if you've got questions, please feel free to contact me at michaeldj@thetechsavvylawyer.page.
Awesome. I love it. Well, Michael, thank you again so much for coming on. It's been great catching up with you.
Likewise, sir. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Law Practice Today podcast, where we bring you conversations and tips on how to run a more effective law practice. Now, if you want to hear more, be sure to stop by the American Bar Association website to see more updates on new episodes as they come out and other awesome resources that are offered by the American Bar Association. Thanks for tuning in.